The interesting and idiosyncratic and I think quite unusual aspect of the Republican National Convention that took place over the last 4 nights in Milwaukee, to me, was the same idiosyncratic and unusual attribute that characterized the first term of the Trump presidency. Namely, on the one hand, you have Trump and people closest to him, including in this case his chosen Vice President, J.D. Vance, who are clearly not just advocating for or campaigning on, but I think are true believers in at least some important sectors of this new populist, anti-establishment kind of politics that has proven so popular within the Republican Party and in the nation more broadly. But then on the other hand, you have people who still occupy extremely important positions, including ones who are very close to President Trump and who seem to be on their way to holding very high positions of power within the Trump presidency, who despise that populist and anti-establishment politics on which Trump is winning and the campaign is based, and on which Trump has dominated the Republican Party over the last 8 years. And it was just like in the first presidency when Donald Trump had a whole variety of views that ended up being subverted and sabotaged because so many of the people he invited into his government at the highest levels not only didn't believe in those views that Donald Trump, the elected president, believed in, but they actually sought overtly to sabotage them. So he ran against neoconservative ideologies. This is one example. And then he had one of the ultimate neocons, Mike Pompeo, who just had a standard warmongering record in the House, very pro-CIA and U.S. security state, who he had run the CIA for the first couple of years and then went and became his Secretary of State. And then, of course, we all know what Nikki Haley's warmongering policies are. And yet, remember, she was the ambassador to the UN in the first Trump presidency, and now Donald Trump is giving hints that she may be part of the presidential team again. On top of that, you have people like Tom Cotton and Marco Rubio, the latter of whom, by all accounts, President Trump put on his short list for vice presidential choices, who certainly are adamantly opposed to all of that. And you have this kind of mishmash of people at the top levels of the Republican Party. I think Trump's major character flaw that caused that is that, as everybody knows, he's very susceptible to flattery. So anybody who comes in and says, I love President Trump, in public or in an interview, is someone who he admits, and he said this in his acceptance speech last night, if somebody loves me, I love them. And you have smart people like Mike Pompeo and Nikki Haley who know how to flatter Donald Trump and therefore get access and power. And I think that was one of the problems of the administration. One of the things that prevented it from being better is that Donald Trump clearly has this character flaw where he immediately embraces and appreciates anyone who praises him. And a lot of people can exploit that to worm their way into power and then work against the ideology that the Republican base is making clear they support. Now, just to give you a few illustrations from the Republican National Convention that make very manifest and vivid this kind of very unusual, not ancillary division ideologically within a party, but often radical and even fully contradictory. So here is David Sachs, who is a billionaire Silicon Valley investor and a very ardent supporter of the Trump campaign. He's one of the people donating a lot of money and participating in PACs and fundraisers to help the Trump campaign. And yet David Sachs is also somebody who has shared almost every view that I have, and John Mearsheimer has, and others have, when it comes to the war in Ukraine. He's vehemently opposed to it. He believes the U.S. government has fed propaganda and lies about what that war is about and why it continues, and that what we're essentially doing is destroying Ukraine. And he was given a very prominent spot to speak at the convention. I believe he spoke on Monday night or Tuesday night, one of the first 2 nights. And here's part of what he said.
First, President Biden botched the Afghanistan withdrawal, displaying incompetence and weakness for the whole world to see. Then he provoked the Russians to invade Ukraine with talk of NATO expansion.
Now, let me just stop there and note how radical that is of a thing to say. It's also accurate. it's demonstrably true. But oftentimes the things that are the most true are the things that are deemed radical and taboo to say. So usually when Republicans are expressing opposition to the war in Ukraine, they'll say things like, I don't think we should be funding this war. I don't think it's doing any good. We don't have the money. We should be spending the money at home. We should get a diplomatic solution. But they'll also say Vladimir Putin was evil and invaded Ukraine in a completely unprovoked way. That's not what David Sacks said. That's not what he believes. He said that the United States went out of its way in many ways to provoke the Russian invasion. And I think it's very hard to argue that, given that we participated in a coup in 2014 that changed the government of Ukraine undemocratically. There was a president who was elected in 2010. His term was to expire in 2015. He was considered not an ardently pro-Moscow president of Ukraine, but one that certainly had friendly relations with Moscow. The EU was angry about that, and so people like Victoria Nuland and John McCain and Chris Murphy and the Clinton State Department overtly supported a coup. It was the Kerry State Department in 2014, changed the government, talking about a bordering state, and then the United States began openly and very vocally speaking about expanding Ukraine to include NATO right up to the most sensitive part of their border. And it has been the known, clear, and oftenly very emphatically stated view of the top levels of the U.S. government that any attempt to expand NATO to Ukraine, or any talk of that in a serious way, will provoke the Russians to enter eastern Ukraine and to annex Crimea, because they will feel such a grave threat from that they will want to create a buffer between the U.S. and NATO and their country. In fact, Bill Burns, the current head of the CIA, was so alarmed in 2008 when two people began talking about expanding NATO up to Ukraine. The Bush-Cheney Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, and her partner in that, who was none other than Victoria Nuland, who was serving as ambassador to NATO at the time under the Bush administration after serving as Dick Cheney's primary foreign policy advisor, and warned in a secret memo that WikiLeaks ended up publishing that everybody in Moscow knows, not just Putin, but even anti-Putin liberals, he said it's across the board, the political spectrum in Moscow, that they regard NATO expansion for Ukraine as an existential threat and that it will provoke a war. So if you have the people at the top levels of your intelligence community writing for years inside the U.S. government that expanding NATO into Ukraine will provoke a Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine and Crimea, and then you go and do exactly what those memos warn you shouldn't do unless you want to provoke a Russian war and Russian invasion, obviously you can make a strong case that what the U.S. was doing in Ukraine, wittingly or not, was highly likely to provoke a Russian invasion. Not because the Russians are insane, but because they're rational, as every single president before Joe Biden, who dealt with Vladimir Putin, said that Putin is a very cunning, rational, calculating, self-interested president. He understands the complexity of foreign affairs, and he will do anything to protect the Russian state, which is his job as Russian president. And so David Sacks stood on the stage and said something that, although very factually, certainly supportable, I would say dispositively true, is not something that you even hear from Republican opponents of the war in Ukraine.
Afterward, he rejected every opportunity for peace in Ukraine, including a deal to end the war just 2 months after it broke out. Now the war is deep into its third year, with no end in sight. Hundreds of thousands of people are dead. Hundreds of billions of our taxpayer dollars have gone up in smoke. President Biden sold us this new forever war by promising it would weaken Russia and strengthen America. Well, how does that look today? Russia's military is bigger than before, while our own stockpiles are dangerously depleted. Every day, there are new calls for escalation, and the world looks on in horror as Joe Biden's demented policy takes us to the brink of World War III.
All right, so that is a extremely clear message about the dangerous idiocy and of the U.S. Funding of the war in Ukraine and the edifice of lies on which it's based. And that's somebody who is a major funder of the Trump campaign. We're also organizing a lot of Silicon Valley support. He's one of the earliest co-founders or high executives in PayPal, which is what gave the wealth to Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, that sort of original group of people in Silicon Valley who remain very powerful to this day and are also helping to support and fund the Trump campaign. So it's a pretty significant indicator of where a lot of people in the Republican coalition, or at least the Trump coalition, are. That's also true of Tucker Carlson, who I think in the only time in his career, and he's been around for 30 years in Washington media and politics, has ever endorsed a candidate or spoken at a presidential convention. He talked about how he was only endorsing Trump after the FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago, which offended him so deeply because it was such a clear weaponization of the justice system and the police force in order to persecute a political opponent, that he felt like he had a duty to stand up because of how dangerous this was. And he too was given a primetime speech at the Republican National Convention, in fact, last night, on the same night that Trump spoke. He's very close to Trump, and Tucker has been one of the most vocal voices from the start against the war in Ukraine. I don't know how many times I was on his show to talk about it, but it was dozens. And this was early on. We were often on the same official list of people who are supposedly propagandists for the Russian government, issued by Ukrainian intelligence and the like. So Tucker's been very consistent on this, and he went to that convention last night, got up on that stage, and gave a similar message with a lot of scorn to the people who support the war in Ukraine, even though many of them are in the Republican Party, were in that building, are in the U.S. Congress, and are also seeking to have high positions with the Trump administration.
Democracy on television? Actual democracy is the proposition that the citizens of a country own that country. They're not renters, they're not serfs, they're not slaves, they are the owners of the country. And for that to be true, their leaders have to represent them, which is another way of saying they have to do what the people want them to do, or a close approximation thereof. But if they completely ignore what people want, not just 1 year, but generationally, say for 50 years, then it may be, I don't know what, it's not a democracy. And so I think the entire Trump project, paradoxically, is attacked as an enemy of democracy, is to return democracy to the United States. Hey, let's pay attention to what people actually want. And the lack of interest in that question in Washington is something that ultimately drove me out of the city after 35 years. Lawmakers stepping over the prostrate bodies of their fellow citizens ODing on drugs to go cast votes to send money to some foreign country. Yeah, actually, we've lost more Americans from drugs in the past 4 years than we lost in World War II. Yeah, our bloodiest war. More than we lost in World War II. Does anybody care? It is pathetic. It is pathetic. And do you hear a single word from Washington about doing anything about it? We know where the drugs are coming from. We know the supply routes. The U.S. military spent billions bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You don't see our commander-in-chief suggesting that we use our military to protect our country or the lives of its citizens. No. That's for Ukraine. And it's too much, actually. It's too insulting. It's too insulting. It's a middle finger in the face of every American. It's a very clear statement, which is unmistakable. And that is, we don't care about you. And Donald Trump, whatever you say about him, and I think he's a wonderful person. I know him well. By the way, the funniest person I've ever met in my life, actually. You can't be funny without perspective or without empathy, which is true. But everything else about Trump aside, he actually cares because he's interested in the people who live here because that's his job. A father's job, his duty is to his family. An officer's duty is to his men. A president's duty is to his citizens. And he seems to be the only one who thinks that.
Now, I haven't confirmed this with Tucker, but several other reporters who were present for the speech said that Tucker came up with no written speech. There was nothing on the teleprompter. He just spoke in an impromptu way. And I have to say, and I've heard this from other people who spoke there, that they were not required to submit their speech ahead of time to the Trump campaign, or even if they were giving the speech to the Trump campaign, that they were never told they couldn't say anything, including people who were probably off message. It was a very free and unstructured convention. And the fact that Tucker was able to get up on the stage, and you can see by the way he's speaking as well, giving an impromptu, unscripted speech with nothing on the teleprompter. Obviously, he's a professional communicator, but still, and that point that he made there, which is the way you know the working class hates you, is they refuse to spend money or take action to prevent dangers in your communities or to fix things that are going wrong in your lives or to improve your lives. No, that's only for Ukraine. We keep spending hundreds of billions of dollars to send to this war in Ukraine or to other countries. And obviously, though he didn't say it, he also means Israel. And that, in his view, in Tucker's view, is a spitting in the face or a middle finger in the face of American citizens, that the members of Congress will step over your dead body to send tens of millions, billions of dollars to foreign wars. Here's J.D. Vance, who, as we reported on Tuesday night when Trump announced Monday night when Trump announced his choice, was somebody whose choice provoked extreme anger, even revolt, by both the neocon wing of the Republican Party as well as the sort of traditional Reaganites who just always want to serve the interest of large corporations, even if it comes at the expense of the American worker, who are in favor of mass immigration because of how it lowers wages and makes the worker powerless because of such a flood of labor, such a supply of labor, that the worker has no leverage. Here's part of what he said about all of this.
My friends, things did not work out well for a lot of kids I grew up with. Every now and then, I will get a call from a relative back home who asks, "Did you know so-and-so?" And I'll remember a face from years ago, and then I'll hear, "They died of an overdose." As always, America's ruling class wrote the checks. Communities like mine paid the price. For decades, that divide between the few with their power and comfort in Washington and the rest of us only widened. From Iraq to Afghanistan, from the financial crisis to the Great Recession, from open borders to stagnating wages, the people who govern this country have failed and failed again. President Trump's vision is so simple and yet so powerful. We're done, ladies and gentlemen, catering to Wall Street. We'll commit to the working man.
All right, so that's part of why the Wall Street Journal freaked out today, had a big editorial saying, what is J.D. Vance doing on the Republican Party ticket? We love Wall Street. Why is he ranting against Wall Street and praising Lena Khan, who's using antitrust law to break up massive, concentrated corporate power in the hands of Amazon or other corporate giants who have no allegiance to the United States or the American worker? So there's a real divide in the Republican Party as well. Now, on the other hand, the convention had people speaking such as Nikki Haley, and we went over her record many times when she was running against Donald Trump. Just a unconstrained warmonger on the most extremist end of the militaristic spectrum, has no convictions of any kind that aren't for sale, just such a vacant, empty opportunist. But for sure, an advocate for the exact kind of Republican ideology that voters led by Donald Trump rejected, which is why she was the last person standing against Donald Trump, because she was trying to get the Republican base to return to the politics of George Bush and Dick Cheney, with which she agrees. Now, before I show you this, I just want to tell you the funniest thing. We don't have this clip, but I saw it earlier today. Nikki Haley in her speech got up and she said, look, the reason why I'm here is because President Trump asked me to be here. And then they cut to President Trump and he was mouthing to whoever was next to him, I didn't ask her, she asked me to be here. She wanted to be here. So you just see this ongoing tension, but at the same time, there have been reports that Trump intends to make Nikki Haley part of his team. We'll see whether or not he does, but she was given a prominent speaking role, and here's part of what she said with it.
When Barack Obama was president, Vladimir Putin invaded Crimea. With Joe Biden as president, Putin invaded all of Ukraine. But when Donald Trump was president, Putin did nothing. No invasion. No invasions, no wars. That was no accident. Putin didn't attack Ukraine because he knew Donald Trump was tough.
Now, look, that clip is pretty much what Nikki Haley's saying there is true. But it sort of led to this broader foreign policy advocacy that what we need always to do is to show that we're ready to go to war, to bomb people, and she's called on that many times. And she represents that version of the Republican Party that people have come to hate. And she used her speech to advocate that, as did the person I think did more to ruin the Trump presidency than anybody, the most destructive force in the Trump presidency, which was Mike Pompeo, who went to Harvard Law, and was able to understand Trump's psychology and how to manipulate it, and became the head of the CIA and then the State Department. He did more than anybody to ensure Julian Assange was prosecuted and that the Ecuadorians lifted the asylum for him, as we've documented many times. And he is a standard neocon, and here he is advocating for standard Republican policy on foreign policy.
You'll remember, for those 4 years, the evil of Vladimir Putin was held at bay. When we walked out, January of 2021, the Iranian regime was afraid, and the people of Israel were strong and secure, and we treated like the friend and ally that they need to be. Everywhere we went, religious freedom was protected. We held 3 summits in North Korea, and North Korea was quieted. We'd begun an honorable exit from Afghanistan. And not a single Chinese spy balloon flew across the United States of America. 4 years. Had I been the Secretary of State and a Chinese spy balloon flew across our country, I would have been the former Secretary of State, and rightfully so. You know, under President Trump, the Chinese Communist Party, which to this day presents the greatest threat to our nation from outside of our country, we confronted it like never before. Look, ladies and gentlemen, in short, we put America first every single day.
Now, that's the standard neocon view of the Middle East and of China, which, by the way, if you listen to Donald Trump on China, he will certainly talk about how it is a rising power. But he never talks about the need to confront it militarily. He talks about the need to compete with it better in terms of trade and American jobs. That's always what he wants to confront China on. He never talks about deploying more military into the South China Sea, building up bases, all surrounding China. In fact, he warns constantly, and did in his speech last night, that you cannot go to war with the nuclear power. In fact, when he talked about his friendly relationship with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, and he was saying, he really likes me, I like him, I think he misses me, I'm glad we're going to be back together soon. And he said, I got criticized for that, but you know what? It's actually a good thing to have open communications with countries with major nuclear weapons. And you have Mike Pompeo instead saying, look, what we need to do is go around the world confronting everybody. And that is not the kind of thing Donald Trump has argued or believes in, and yet you can see how clever Mike Pompeo is in pretending that he shares Donald Trump's vision while advocating this standard neocon view of the Middle East and every other region in the world. Now, the Republican Party is very aware, the establishment wing is, that their dogma is in danger if they just allow Trump on his own to go and do what he wanted to do. They were desperate to put Marco Rubio, or someone like that on the vice presidential ticket. It's why they were so angry when instead he chose J.D. Vance, someone who far more is aligned with Trump's populism and anti-establishment view of foreign policy and economic policy. And now the traditional Republicans are highly focused, intensely working to ensure that the people who end up running foreign policy in the Trump administration, who run the CIA and the Pentagon, are the people whose ideology were the exact ones Trump vowed to cleanse from Washington and the Republican Party. Here from Semaphore on March 19th, the senators who could fill Trump's national security cabinet, quote, Donald Trump is eyeing 3 Republican senators, Bill Hagerty, Tom Cotton, and Marco Rubio, for key national security posts if he wins the White House in November, people close to the Trump campaign told Semaphore. The conservative lawmakers are all prominent hawks on China and Iran and supporters of increased U.S. spending on defense and border security. Trump sees the politicians as potentially partnering with cabinet members and advisors from his first term to create a more unified national security team from day one, these people said. Among the first-term confidants Trump is expected to consider for top jobs, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, John Ratcliffe, a one-time congressman who served as director of national intelligence, former national security advisor Robert O'Brien, and Trump's ambassador to Germany, Rick Grinnell. So tell me about a team that are the standard Republican hawks in the Republican Party. Now, who knows who this person close to the Trump campaign is, if they are somebody who wants this, but there's definitely all kinds of talk about the Republican Party, the establishment pro-war wing, putting those kinds of people in those positions of power, especially after the choice of J.D. Vance. And that's a lot of what happened in Trump's first administration. He was surrounded by unelected operatives in the deep state, in the administrative state, but also in his own White House and his own administration, who were actively working to sabotage his campaign. His presidency, one of the worst examples being that he ordered the withdrawal of troops, U.S. troops from Syria, and various generals and other national security types just ignored it. They blocked it. They pretended not to believe that he was really ordering the withdrawal of troops completely because they didn't want to. And I remember the media and liberals standing up and clapping and cheering for the adults in the room, meaning unelected generals who are thwarting Trump's policies. It's impossible to have a worse attack on civilian rule in American democracy, as the Constitution understands it, than to have military officials who there permanently, who are not elected, overriding the policy orders of Donald Trump. They hid classified information from him. This was all reported and celebrated, even though few things are more undemocratic than that. But in a lot of ways, Trump allowed it to happen by putting in the kinds of people who were helping to do that. And it seems like at least some people close to Trump, and maybe Trump himself, are considering doing that again. And I think the question is going to be who he listens to. He was very close to picking Marco Rubio or someone like that. And it was only at the last minute that a team of people, including Donald Trump Jr., who is far more on that better side of the Republican divide, and others as well, prevailed on him to select J.D. Vance, Tucker Carlson being one of them, who helped make J.D. Vance a national figure by constantly putting him on his show. He's friends with him. So you can see this internal conflict, and we'll see what the first President Trump term looks like. Now, as I said, he selected J.D. Vance. It enraged a lot of the Wall Street corporatist types in the Republican Party, including the Wall Street Journal. And yet, bizarrely, Trump has been talking about making Jamie Dimon his U.S. Treasury Secretary. Here from Reuters, July 16. Trump says he molds Jamie Dimon for the U.S. Treasury and won't try ousting the Fed's Powell. Now, Jamie Dimon was the CEO of Citigroup during the financial collapse. Obama adored him. He adored Obama. You cannot find a worse corporatist and Wall Street tycoon than Jamie Dimon. He used to despise Trump. Trump talked about him as a sort of corrupt scumbag. I don't know if Jamie Dimon has been privately, knowing that Trump was likely to be elected, aggrandizing Trump and talking well of him. But after you select J.D. Vance, who rants against Wall Street, you then talk about making Jamie Dimon your Treasury Secretary. Quote, on Diamond, Trump said he was considering him for the top job at the Treasury Department. Trump also said in the interview that he would reduce the corporate tax rate to as low as 15%. Trump had until recently been critical of Diamond. Last year, Trump called Diamond, quote, a highly overrated globalist on his True Social platform. JP Morgan declined to comment on Trump's remarks. Jamie Dimon is the CEO of JP Morgan. So there you have that exact tension that we're talking about here. He's a corrupted globalist, and then you turn around and say, I want to put him in charge of the economy as the Treasury Secretary. And I don't think that necessarily means that that faction will prevail, but I think it is signifying that the same sort of internal tensions and conflict that drove the first Trump presidency, and I think impeded and settled it a lot of ways, potentially seems to repeating itself. And the question is, who's going to be in Trump's ear and who he's going to listen to? Obviously, there's going to be a lot of pushback against that. Just to conclude, here is an article on Haaretz on July 19th, extremely angry that Tucker Carlson was given the right to speak at the Republican convention. And here you see the headline, Tucker Carlson, isolationist, Israel skeptic, and anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist, is winning the battle inside the GOP. I wish that were true. As Jewish Republicans insisted that the GOP is the only, quote, pro-Israel party throughout the convention in Milwaukee, the final night made it clear that Tucker Carlson wields the real power over policy and over Donald Trump. So first of all, yet again, you have Tucker Carlson, simply because he has questioned whether or not the United States should be paying for the role in Israel, now being branded an anti-Semite, and trying to scare American Jews into believing that because Tucker has influence within the Republican Party and the Trump presidency, it means that Jews ought to fear him. You can see, yet again, that when you have people who are anti-establishment and the establishment looks like they are in danger of losing power, they have all kinds of weapons, very serious weapons that they unleash to fight back. They helped prosecute Trump, they helped impeach Trump, all of which gave them leverage over Trump to prevent him from doing things they didn't want him to do. There is no such thing as an establishment that simply allows you to take away their power and take away their prerogatives. They have all kinds of weapons to fight back, and that sort of article, which I hope ends up being true, is a very clear example of how that's typically done.